microphone. Thank you for joining Tech Tuesday number 15. Today we're going to talk about experiments. Not how do you get IP for experiments, but how do you do experiments in IP? Now, we start off with something all of you probably know, that patent attorneys are very conservative. And there's some justifiable reasons and some less justifiable reasons. The justifiable ones is that patents are very delicate, everything is very complicated. You learn by watching somebody else, everybody around you is like you. And the less justifiable reasons are that, we don't know what's going to happen, so let's not change what we're doing. And nobody ever got fired for doing the best practice, and nobody's really providing oversight. Yes, sometimes we have a little bit of oversight. Be it as it may, patent attorneys are very conservative. And the opposite of being conservative is being progressive, but we're not going to talk about the entire range of that. We're just going to talk about experimentation. So first of all, there's an opportunity. If you agree with me that most patent attorneys are conservative, perhaps too conservative, then there's a lot of empty niches and let's call it money left on the table that we can get for our clients. And I can tell you from personal experience, when the law changes, it sometimes takes 5 or 10 years for people to change their practices in view of the law or in view of court cases. Not everybody, but many patent attorneys. In addition, there's an obligation to our clients. The world is changing all the time, and how are we going to adapt to it? There's new markets, there's new technologies, there's new laws, new problems and new opportunities, and we can either learn by copying other people who are more adventurous, or we can experiment. Now, our clients, it's more complicated. They deal with innovation all day, so experimentation is a second nature to them. But they probably expect us to be stodgy and square and not do anything that has any risk in it whatsoever. Any case, there's what people call the scientific method, which is that you make a theory, you experiment, test the theory, you learn from the results, and you do it again. Just want to make it clear that when you want to do innovation in IP, which is not the subject, but it's a broader issue, there are other ways you can do. There are also other ways you can do in science. If you take the conservative solution, that is also an experiment. It's a null hypothesis that doing what everybody did until now will continue working. I want to make it clear that scientific methods can never be enough for our kind of work because science can only go so far. And we can never have enough data in order to be sure about what we're doing, and the world is changing. One last very important point. When you decide to take a risk, that is not an experiment, it is not conservative, and it's often the right thing to do. In other words, when you decide to file a patent application which you might not get, that's a risk. It's not an experiment yet. Why is experimentation difficult? First of all, you can fail. And if you make an experiment and you fail, it will cost somebody money and it will cost you prestige. It's difficult to do an experiment because you get slow feedback. Very, very difficult to get control conditions, statistics. I mean, how many office action responses do you need to have where you test whether arguing about a 112 issue or folding on a 112 issue is more effective? How many office actions like that you need to do in order to get information which one is the right one? You have to find the opportunity, okay? Not every opportunity is suitable for an experiment. We usually don't file patent applications on our own just in order to experiment. We need the client to be a willing participant in the experiment for various reasons, including that it's usually his patent application and his price. We have to justify the experiment because experiments have upsides and downsides. They're not theoretical experiments. We have to be able to use a result. Sometimes we do an experiment. By the time we have the result, there's nothing we can do with it. Experiments often require the cooperation of business people. What do I mean? When we're filing a patent application or making an argument, the value of what we're doing is tied in with the business processes. So if the people on the business side are not cooperating with us, we might have information about the IP, but not about the value of what we did. So if I have to summarize all of this, we're definitely not talking about scientific experimentation, something more like empirical experimentation, which means we shouldn't expect to be reductionist, to take one variable and separate it out and then be able to generate some sort of applicability of the results of the experiment. So experimenting is difficult and not scientific. Now, how do you know when to experiment, when not to experiment? So I have previously mentioned this Sinofin, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, framework by David Snowden, and divides the world into different situations. I'd like to call your attention to complicated and clear. In clear, everybody knows what to do. You see what situation you are, okay? It's what's called sense. You know where you are, you categorize it, and you respond. Complicated, there's no correct answer, but there's best practice. You should file no more than 15 claims in Europe. In a response to a restriction requirement, you shouldn't give up completely on your other inventions because you might never file a divisional. Good practice. Complex and chaotic is where we're talking. Complex, I'd just like you to know, is probe, sense, respond, and chaotic is act, sense, respond. In a complex situation, there are clear rules, but the system is so complicated, we don't so complex. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen. So if you do a little probing, a small experiment, you can see where you are. Chaotic is what they call here novel practice. You have to act. You can't just probe. You have to act, and hopefully you will learn from acting what is right and what is wrong. And so basically the experiments we're talking about are divided into experiments to see if the best practice is indeed the best practice, experiments to see if maybe a different practice is a better practice when you have good practice, experiments to see where you are in the space of possibilities, and experiments to figure out what the bleep you're supposed to be doing. Okay? Different types of experiments. I just want to define what an experiment is. You identify that you have several choices to act in a way that uses IP or affects IP, and you don't know which one is best, or you suspect you might be wrong about which one is best. Of course, if you think you know which one is best, maybe you're wrong. And I want to emphasize that sometimes you have to work in order to generate a choice. Okay, an experiment means I have A and B. Sometimes there's only A available, and you have to work to generate an option B. Client, and we'll have examples later. The best thing to do is to do a certain action which has a 50% chance of success. Okay, obviously, we would like to find out if there's a better way. But we don't know a better way, so we have to generate a better way and then decide if we want to experiment. In any case, we make a choice and we act accordingly. If you change the way you're acting in the middle, we'll have a mess. And most important, you need to track the results. If all you did was do a risky activity, it could be a good move, but it's not an experiment. It's taking a risk. Maybe it's a calculated risk. Maybe it's Hail Mary. Okay, experiments have to do with learning. We're doing an experiment because we want to learn. So you've heard that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. And you might have heard that you need to throw one away because you will anyway. That's about prototypes. And you also know that lottery tickets are very bad economics. But if you are down and out, the only opportunity to succeed will be a lottery ticket. What all of this means is, since we're going to break some eggs and we want to know if we're going to gain anything, you have to have clarity regarding the potential upside and the potential downside of what you're doing. Okay? And what do I mean when we talk about potential upside and potential downside? Obviously, you can kill the patent if we're talking about patents, but that's not important. Okay? Our question is not the IP itself. Our question is the business value generated by the IP. So if we did an experiment and the patent failed, but the business was not affected, well, not much downside. But if we had the potential to get a patent which would block all the competitors, that's upside. So the question again is not whether or not the IP will survive, but the business values that we generate. And we don't go into an experiment unless we can evaluate what the potential upside looks like and what the potential downside looks like. Getting an incredibly broad patent, which has no business value, will make you feel like, great patent attorneys, but there's no upside here. And just as an example, usually in a startup company, the first patent application they file is very risk averse. They want to get a granted patent that has value. They don't want to do an experiment, which might help them later on, but could cause them to wait another 2 years to get a patent and might cause them to get a rejection, which looks bad for the investors. That's a typical case of when not to do an experiment. So I thought about making a list of experiments, and I have a few later. Here's some examples of experiments you can do. The first type is risk-taking versus data collection. And I said before, we're practically never going to do an experiment where we're just collecting data. We're usually also taking a risk of getting less IP, more IP, spending more money. It's not just collecting information about what do examiners like to hear. However, if you're in an interview is a low-risk situation, which you can use for data collection. Okay? Depending on the situation, I'm sure you can imagine that talking to the examiner and understanding what kind of language would be more convincing and what kind of language would be less convincing, and what do they believe in his or her art unit is a type of data collection. It's a type of experiment because we definitely keep track, but there's not a lot of risk. Some of the experiments are based on a theory of what's going to work, but more often it's based on observation. Oh my, somebody did something, let's try too. Or based on intuition. We believe we deserve to get such and such. You all know about A/B testing. I'll caveat later, but usually n equals 1. 2. Controlled experiments, you're not going to see. Now, retrospective experiments. You're familiar with Joystat. Joystat allows you to look at what other people did. So they collect information about examiners. They collect information about what methods work. This is very valuable, but it's only retrospective. Another thing, which is not exactly an experiment, is outlier analysis. If you have somebody who's really good, let's try to figure out why they're really good. And that leads me to the very important point. Even if you didn't actually do the experiment, just The preparation for the experiment of looking at the baseline, finding examples, and building a theory can move you forward a lot. Here are few examples of reasons for why we want to do an experiment. These are all subjects, just few of many, where we don't know the answer. Can we get IP for some invention? Can we use certain IP to capture more value? What response will best convince the examiner? How to deal with Alice while I'm drafting? Field with a lot of experimentation. What's the best way to use ChatGPT in order to increase the output of a patent attorney? What's better, a few big fat applications or a large number of thin applications, and in what context? What IP will increase the company value? I'd love to know the answer to that. Should I keep it a trade secret or should I file a patent? Now, all of these appear to be questions that as experts, we opine and we follow whatever we believe in. But in truth, if you can do an experiment and get more data, we'll do a much better job. You guys, how to know when an experiment is an option? Well, you should have a low downside and a high upside. We should be able to learn something. And in particular, when there's a phase change, for example, just before an investment. Okay, so we write a patent application in order to highlight to investors the value of our client. That could take a few years, but if you know that there's an investment in 2 months and you're able to get a quick grant on some patents, you're going to get information immediately. You won't have to wait 2 or 3 years. Another point, the risk to the patent attorney is not the same as the risk to the firm and not the same as the risk to the client. First of all, is failure acceptable? What does your insurance company think about an experiment that fails? Who's providing the budget? Client, okay? So the client has to agree in writing that we're doing an experiment and that he understands the risk of doing A rather than doing B. I said before, you need to have buy-in because you have non-IP activities and you need help from the client to understand the cost, the risk assessment, and also failure acceptance. Okay, so we're not doing these experiments alone. When we do experiments, we consider the portfolio as a whole. Unfortunately, patent applications are not really modular, and we've all seen examples where one word on page 25 of the application ruined the entire application for everybody. Some bad definition, some bad example, some misuse of a word. So when you do an experiment, you're going to affect perhaps an entire application, perhaps others. When we do an experiment, we can succeed, we can fail, and we can just, also that you need to learn from. Most important, make sure the feedback comes at a time you can use it. Who's you? The client, patent attorney, the firm? Let me give you an example. I have a client with a deep learning invention, and right now the law is going crazy in all IP aspects, patent, copyright, secrets, and so on. So you have to experiment. Will you get information usable for this client? I don't know. But there's no question that the risk to the client and the risk to the attorney are aligned. Both of you know that your chance of getting a patent is low, and you need to know as much as possible about what kind of patent you can get. Here's another example of an experiment. What do you do when there's a big time disparity between the technology and the market? So are you familiar with the Lemerson bar scanning patents? So in the 1950s, he filed a patent that basically says, use a camera to look at a code printed on a box so that we can track the box through the supply chain. I'm oversimplifying. In the 1970s and 80s, everybody started using barcodes on boxes that could be read using some type of imager. He had to keep his patents alive for many, many years. He did it using something called a submarine patent, which means that you file a patent application and it doesn't publish, and then you continue and it doesn't publish, so people don't know to be careful. That's a huge experiment, and it paid off incredibly. A lot of big pharma IP practice has the same problem. How do we get protection to last more than 20 years? Big money involved, a lot of experimentation. Another situation, you're having a difficult examination. You really need to figure out if it's an examiner or the whole art unit, or maybe it's a technology, or maybe it's a prior art. You can figure out using experimentation. Here's an example, and it's actually based on something people are actually doing. You have a client that built a ChatGPT based system that does CBT for you. And that's it, you're dead. Why? The CBT is practiced by the patient in his head. The fact that the computer generates something, well, you can't protect it using copyright. There's 101 issues from here to the kazoo. There's no tangible output. Who are you going to sue? It's a medical treatment method. Okay? So the answer is you have to try multiple different methods and hope that one of them is going to work. And hope that you'll have an answer while your client is still alive.